Let's now hear from Sarah about the actual practical approach to all these suggestions we are making. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is Sarah Oceng from Nairobi. Can you hear me properly? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Sarah.
Yes, can you please start the video? It says it's disabled. Yeah, from our part.
Okay, we'll do
as
that.
I share my screen in my presentation.
But in the meantime, you can speak, Sarah. We can hear you loud and clear.
Hold on, let me share my screen. Let me know if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, now we can. We can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you, David, and the entire Mkutano conferencing for putting this fantastic event together. And number two, for giving us an opportunity to share our experience and hopefully to be able to inform a bit of your thinking in this critical area of green industrial zones. So my name is Sarah Oceng. I work with IFC, that is the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group, and I cover Eastern and Southern Africa. I'm the focal point for special economic zones, as well as some of the sectors in manufacturing. So, and we met with David at Ozone's event that we held in Nairobi in June last year. And I think from that event, David had said to us, it might be good to have a similar event in Kampala, I mean, hence today. And I'm sorry, I was supposed to travel to be there in person, but I couldn't because I have a family situation that required today. So, so I think to start, to kick off, important that we take ourselves a few steps back, and just to ensure that we all have a common understanding what we mean when we talk about special economic zones before we actually look into the greening aspects of special economic zones.
Sarah.
The reason why.
Excuse me. Excuse me.
Yes, please.
Could you kindly put your screen in presenter mode? So
okay, we're doing that.
So the slides can easily can be seen clearly.
Okay, just hold on. We are doing that. Just give us a second.
Okay. Sorry, we just wanted to capture everything very clearly.
Okay. Let me see how I can just going to do that.
It's okay, then you can just put it back and then we direct you.
No, we have the IT guy who's trying to help us. Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so let me see if I can share again.
Okay, Sarah, if we go back to the presentation at the bottom.
Yeah.
You'll see, okay.
Yes.
There, thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much.
Right. Yeah, so as I was saying, I think before we get into the concept of green industrial zones, I think it might be good for us to sort of revisit what our understanding is on special economic zones. The reason why I think it's important to do this is based on some discussions we've been having all the way to the ACFTA level, and we feel like different countries have different understandings of what the special economic zones are. So we feel it's important to sort of highlight, typically, yes, as the CEO, as the MD of the Uganda Free Zones Authority clearly stated, yes, there are demarcated geographical areas where the rules of business are different from those in the regular national territory. So the question is, why, in what areas are they different? So we need to figure out the fact that there's infrastructure differences in special economic zones. So typically for an area to qualify as a special economic zone, they need to have really good infrastructure, access, quality, reliability, cost of water, the road networks, the electricity, and all of that. Number two is they're also special in the sense that they have a unique customs regime, and as the MD of Uganda Free Zones Authority clearly stated, they're operating outside the normal customs territory in the country. Number three, and really importantly, it's the regulatory regime that's offered within the special economic zones. How effective is the licensing for businesses, the planning, the flexibility? So really, the entire range of indicators regarding ease of doing business, and that's typically why I think most well-functional zones tend to have a one-stop shop for their entire business operations. And then lastly, I think it's the fiscal regime. I think all of us agree in terms of the task of fiscal incentives that need to be provided. But it's really important that we have these four key pillars in mind as we think about what special economic zones are, and I guess this will sort of lead us into how we approach the green industrial zones. The other thing also is the assumption that special economic zones always succeed, and the truth of the matter is when you look at a lot of these studies that have been done either by the World Bank Group or by UNCTAD or UNIDO, is most special economic zones actually do not succeed. And most of them actually have just marginal impact. But the beautiful thing about this is drawing those lessons from the 80s and the 90s, I think we've learned along the way how to structure special economic zones that will have some good success for the countries in terms of really achieving the economic outcomes. So the question is, why do they not succeed? And I know we give a lot of examples of, China and Shenzhen and what's happened in Korea, what's happened in Singapore. Like even with the Chinese experience, over 90% of zones in China have not succeeded. They do have maybe 7 to 8% that have been hugely successful, and those they've marketed quite broadly around the world. So we've had a lot of lessons across all these jurisdictions. I think success depends on timing, really. But most importantly, I think success of special economic zones has to be driven to be based on what private sector want to see. I think hence this sort of Mkutano engagement is really encouraging and great for us because it's driven by private sector who've come to the table and they're telling us, development partners and government, that we need support in this area towards achieving green industrial zones. To us, I think that already demonstrates that in the Uganda case, there's a strong private sector demand for this, and that's a critical success factor for special economic zones. The other thing is really, how do you design your enabling framework? I mean, how are your laws, how are your regulations, how are your institutions that are going to really facilitate private sector investors, both at park level and at enterprise level? So really, ultimately, it's three things. How do you as a country conceptualize your special economic zones? What do they mean for you? What do you want them to achieve for you from an economic indicators perspective? And then how do you design them? Because not all of them are the same, depending on the sectors you want to focus on. And then most importantly, I think, how do you deliver them? So a lot of this, you have to think about these three areas concurrently to be able to have an effective special economic zones program and regime, and of course, economic impact. So with this, it's really, so what are the structural features of a good practice special economic zone and draw this from lessons across several countries. So number one, and I discussed this with David a few weeks ago, is the enabling environment, the regularities, and has to cover a number of the overall investment, trade, and operating rules to ensure they're very simple and very transparent and very, very easy to follow to ensure that there's that predictability in business planning. Number two, the issues of your regulatory regime being aligned to international standards of practice. Because typically, again, as the MD of the Free Zones Authority said, I think a lot of our zones across the continent have been export focused for the longest time. Of course, this will change a bit as we look into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and as we become one domestic market. So we'll be focusing more on feeding into our domestic market across the continent, and of course with a bit of export into the other markets, the EU, the US, and the Asian countries. A special economic zone, a good one, will have to really look at things from an end-to-end perspective. So touching on issues of land and environment, and how you start up, issues of labor and work permits, how does labor enter and leave the zone, and if it's partnership between government and private sector, what sort of private partnership arrangements do you have for the operational models for the zones? Again, I'm glad we have a strong financial sector present in the room with us today. Issues of capital, the affordability, especially of long-term financing, given the nature of investments in the zones, certification of products to ensure there's easier movement of the products into the sort of
Hello, Sarah, are you there? Sarah, are you still with us? We seem to have a connection issue there with the network, but like she was saying, she was outlining some of the things, the issues that normally help these free zone areas work, or why they do not work. And this is what she was actually listing. And as we try to reconnect to her, I'll just like to randomly
I think there was a question. I think Madame Olive raised something on branding.
Yes.
Which perhaps Linda can
respond
take the
as
opportunity
we reconnect. Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Mr. Linda, do you remember the questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Thank you. Who benefits from these customs exempted importations of packaging materials? I think that was the first question. Yes, anybody who is licensed to develop and operate a free zone, a special economic zone, a free port, as long as they are going to export 80% of their annual factory output. That's number one.
Most ministries will deliver
it
required of them.
Oh, okay. If she's back, then I think I'll continue after. Thank you.
Administrative investments from government. So yes, we do have private sector and very private sector driven, but government has to have a lot of skin in the game in terms of the administrative investment to ensure the zones work very well. So we talked about having an effective legal framework, and David, I think this is borrowing from you. Unfortunately, Jean-Paul Gauthier, our legal consultant, was not able to join us for this, so I'll cover a bit of that on this slide. So the legal framework really has to have management, especially into green industrial zones. So the planning controls, the environmental guidelines, issues of compliance, and how you fast track some of those environmental permits, but not fast tracking, but yes, but not compromising on the actual process and quality. Again, a good legal framework has to have clarity on how you do the licensing. Again, we talked about the one-stop shop for effective special economic zones regimes. And remember, the one-stop shop is not just in the regulator. The one-stop shop has to be actually on site in the actual zone. So when we talk about government making heavy administrative investments, it means actually government will have to ensure that each zone has an operational one-stop shop to ease service provision. Then, of course, issues of fiscal and administrative, fiscal policy and tax administration will have to be taken care of. I think it's not just providing a low tax regime, but really ensuring that the administration of that tax, the tax is quite transparent, effective, and quite simple to follow. Then issues of trade facilitation and customs. I think that's one that we need to be very focused on, especially for countries like Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania and all that are within one customs union. I see a lot of special economic zones in Kenya actually currently struggling with issues of customs, because some of those things were not factored into the initial regulations in Kenya. So there's a bit of a struggle with goods accessing EAC markets. So I think it's really important for countries to be able to ensure their regulations are very clear on issues of customs because of market access. Flexibility and efficient labor rules, again, are very key in terms of what flows through. Do you have similar rules applying in the special economic zones on labor matters? Similar to what's happening in the regular national territory? How do you facilitate issues of work permits? Again, I'd like to use what's happening in Kenya and parts of Southern Africa in work permits, where we are struggling with a lot of the big players coming into the zones because we didn't have good clarity on how they're going to issue work permits, especially for the higher end skills. So it might be good to sort of factor this in earlier on in the game. Dispute resolution, again, is quite key. And then, of course, interpretation of the laws. So with that background, so a lot has changed over the years with the experiences had. So the world moved from industrial zones 1.0 to 2.0. Now we're in 3.0, moving into sustainable industrial zones, or green zones, as we call them. So the question is, why have we? Sorry, at least we're a bit ahead. But why have we moved? There? Number one, I think it's really, of course, we have the climate change issues we have to address. But most importantly, it's what the buyers are demanding. The buyers are asking a lot of the special economic zones enterprises, especially the ones in manufacturing, for this product to be able to access some of the higher end markets, especially the markets that have more stringent regulatory standards. So typically from where we are to ensure that our enterprises and our special economic zones are competitive, I think it's really for us to adopt industrial zones 3.0, but most importantly going more towards sustainable green zones. So I put this slide here more to just sort of show what the ecosystem and the players of a sustainable green zones environment will look like. So I will start from the bottom left of my screen. So I think critically it's the national policymakers and the government. Why does the government want to go into green industrial zones and green manufacturing? I think as the CEO said again, the fact that the law already has provisions for green zones starting from 2014. I think it's really key in terms of increasing income generation for governments, because I think enterprises, that when countries go green, I think they sell at a much better way. Number two, it's the issue of resources. It lowers dependence on the non-renewable energy sources. vision for national green growth, and then of course to be able to attract investments into low carbon zones. For the zones, stakeholders and institutions like the Uganda Free Zones Authority, of course, this is really key for them in terms of how they position the zones in Uganda competitively around the world, and also in terms of how they can improve the quality of services they provide and cost and revenues. For us, development partners like the World Bank Group and all that, it's really our mandate as part of the United Nations to support countries to ensure we are promoting sustainable socioeconomic development in countries, but also really working towards the targets of lowering the greenhouse gas emissions. For private sector, most importantly, the most important people in this entire ecosystem, I think it's improved productivity. Yes, you might have an initial upfront higher cost in setting up green zones, but eventually it's going to reduce your operating costs, and then of course promoting resource efficiency in the industries that you're rolling out. For investors in the room, the financial sector, I think the returns will be much more attractive, and you're also helping you handle a lot of your sustainability issues. For our buyers and NGOs, of course, it's promoting really sustainable livelihoods and really giving us the proper linkage to global value chains. So what is the approach that we typically look into when we are looking at green industrial zones? So the approach is on the ecosystem. The key thing is here, we are trying to leverage and catalyze new and sustainable private sector investments. So with this, what is the one thing we focus on? Of course, the legal and regulatory framework, I think we covered that. But in this particular instance, in addition to having the broader legal and regulatory framework for special economic zones, you need to really have regulations dedicated to green industrial zones, and if possible, even drill down further to really looking at them from a sectoral perspective, because I believe if you're looking at something in agro-processing, it might be a bit different from looking at some steel sector and all of that. So it will be good to sort of drill those regulations down so that the rules of the game are very clear to the private sector and also to the promoters and branding of the zones. Because if you have an agro zone, then you have a dedicated framework for an agro zone. The second area is we look at in the ecosystem of promoting green zones is how do you address the issue of the infrastructure and logistics of that. The third area is, of course, really focusing on the industry. So both from a park developer level as well as enterprise level, it has to be focused on low carbon growth and reduction of the carbon. You have to communicate. It's part of the branding. I forgot the name of the lady who talked about branding. I really like what she said, but communication and branding is key. Is key for this. Again, you have to really have targeted investment promotion. Like we said, if you're looking at a green industrial zone, you're looking at an agro processing or particular value chains in agro processing, then your investment targeting will have to be, your investment promotion will have to be very targeted towards whether it's domestic companies or regional companies or global companies that you feel will most benefit from what your regulatory environment is offering. And then remember, it's not, yes, there might be demarcated geographical regions within a country, but what made us move from industrial zones 1.0, 2.0 to 3.0 was because 1.0 and 2.0 were never focused on the actual backward linkages and integrating with the normal ecosystem of the country. They sat there as enclaves of their own, very much focused on pushing goods towards export markets. But one of the things we've realized towards 3.0 is economic zones work best when they're better integrated into the local economy. So you create those important linkages and supply chains and all of that. So to that extent, I mean, whatever you have within your zones has to be very much linked to what you have within your broader national trade and investment policies, as well as your sector-specific policies at the national level. Then the big issue of skills and education, as we are structuring these zones, how are we ensuring that our tertiary, our institutions, whether tertiary or technical colleges and all that, are producing the skills that will actually ready for the industry after these zones. We don't want to end up in a situation where you look at the pharmaceutical sector, like what we are seeing in Kenya, where 70% of the labor cost in the pharmaceutical sector goes to expatriate skills. So that significantly increases the cost of production for a lot of these companies, making them less competitive. So as we are addressing all of these things as part of the ecosystem, let's also look at the issue of skills, yes, higher end skills, but also really technical or polytechnic level skills. And then helping linking with markets and buyers. So as our people are producing, and especially if we're going to get our SMEs to come and be part of the zones and supply into the anchor investments and all of that, and to grow the SMEs, we'll need to find a way to link our SMEs with the market buyers out there, so our SMEs start to understand what some of these buyers and some of these markets are. Market shop and the investment aftercare. I think, yes, many times we focus on how we bring in the investors, but we don't focus on how we care for them once they set up. So every zone needs to have their proper one-stop shop center for investor entry, but also investor aftercare. Then for partnership with private sector and government, of course, do we have the appropriate PPP legal framework and operational model for the zones? And lastly, and most importantly, underpinning green industrial zones is environmental and social excellence. That cannot be compromised on. So moving on, I think we talked about why we're introducing eco-industrial parks, the fact that farms are taking sustainability and circular economy principles quite seriously. The global market has gone green. Products have to be sustainable. And then when you look at the countries that have really adopted this and increasing in their eco-industrial park models, in the East Asia Pacific region, I believe Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and now even China are leading on this. And I think we can see clearly how by the fact that they began adopting this, how that has really increased the marketability and the return on investments on their goods in some of these leading markets in the West. So what are we looking at here really in a nutshell? So what we're doing is we're actually integrating policies and markets. So whether it's policies around and really having a clear programmatic approach to this. And this is really key, especially for government, not to look at all of these things in silos that, planning for utilities and logistics is a standalone, planning for land and land use standalone, trade standalone, skills standalone. All these things, I think government has to look at this thing from a programmatic perspective and see that these are all cogs into the same green industrial zones program for the country, and also looking at how you're building the capacity of your regulator to be able to really be able to coordinate and ensure that all of these cogs are moving well together. Sorry. So I wanted to take us a little bit more technical. So from seeing that we're integrating markets and policies, so what are they doing in terms of how do you, because it's easy to tell government that, come up with a national framework for green industry. Yes, you do have the mention in the law of 2014, but I think there has to be a very clear national framework. So what does government look at typically in a national framework for green industrial zones? So you have the policy and policy design that you need to have in place. You need to really look at what are your key performance requirements, your performance indicators, the standards you're looking at, both from buildings and management systems, and what sort of government structures do you need to have in place at national, subnational level, and what sort of financial mechanisms are you going to have in place? So those things have to be very key pillars in the broader policy design at a national level. And even as you design the policy, you have to start really thinking through, as we said, initially, yes, it is quite expensive to sort of get into implementation of green industrial zones. So again, with the banks sitting in the room together with the government, how are we going to look at the policy implementation? But most importantly, how is that going to be financed? What are the different sources? Government's own revenue sources, the local financial institutions, the DFIs like the IFCs and AFDBs of the world. Again, that has to be very clear at a policy level. And then you also need to look at the issues of sorry, I should have gone to market assessment first. The issues of market assessment. What is the market actually asking you here? What is the private sector asking you here? And so it's really important that a really detailed market analysis and diagnostic is done, and that involves really very active stakeholders and all that. Then that's what informs your policy design, then into policy implementation and financing, and then you look at now how you operate and adopt your national framework for green zones. And as you can see from this what do you call that, from the graph and all that, it takes time. So up to 1 year alone is for market assessment, to really engage the market, engage the stakeholders, look at what they want, what sectors are they looking for, what do they want to see in your policy design. And then it takes you 2 to 5 years to look at the enabling legislation and regulatory institutions. Of course, this can be shortened because right now we do have a lot of lessons that we've learned from a lot of different jurisdictions that we can actually borrow, so we don't have to reinvent in some of way to prepare some of these sites. Which sites are you going to work on and prioritize? Then with the detailed feasibility studies, then now you go into the actual zone development, operation, and then promotion and marketing. So the first 1 to 2 to 5 years is really what we call phase 1. That's the national government's role in terms of designing the framework, and then we can go into phase 2, which will typically involve the park level aspects. But as we look at phase 1, I think maybe this slide might be much more clearer for the government's participants in the room. So what are the enabling issues at the national level for the framework? I think it's clear those the 5 pillars: rules and regulations, financing mechanisms, the institutions, stakeholder engagement, and that really informs your national framework. Then once you have the framework, then phase 2 step in, the Davids of the world with implementation at park level for eco-industrial parks, because you'd have provided that framework for them. So for the developers in the room, in terms of phase 2, how broadly at a high level we look at eco-industrial parks. Again, you need to ensure that you have very strong stakeholder commitment, depending on what activities you're trying to do with your site. So your stakeholders are, of course, your national government, your communities, your NGOs, your financiers, and all of this. What commitment do they have? And based on that, your pre-feasibility, and then you can do your park level action plan. So as you can see, the entities that are really responsible for this initial critical step are you yourselves as park operators, and the key agencies, the park or farm level reps, and as well as the local governments. We talk about some of the tools you need to have in place in that. So the MOUs you need to have in place, the discussions you need to have, some of the surveys you need to conduct to ensure that whatever information you have is actually factual information from a qualitative as well as quantitative perspectives, and that you have the right data points and data sets in place to use. And then, of course, using all of that, if your site is deemed feasible based on the step 1, I think you need to establish your eco-industrial park management team. And so the needs of the team, the skill sets that you need for the various players in the team, because you do have, from the promotion aspects, the technical aspects, the environmental aspects, you need a lot of different skill sets for your team right there to set up that. Then how are you going to have your audits? How are you going to monitor and evaluate your performance and your performance assessment and all of that? And of course, how are you going to build your business cases, report, and then finally, how are you going to go into the market? So thank you. I will stop there. Sorry, I was rushing a bit. I'm mindful of time, but I was trying to cover as much as I can in the slot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And a round of applause for Sarah.